Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In the last lecture, we talked about America's involvement in World War II and how at long last victory had been achieved. But even before the shouting faded away, and even before the radioactive ash from two atomic weapons had settled to the ground, America found itself in another stinking war, namely the Cold War. But don't worry, there was no actual shooting in the Cold War. Only 44 years of every moment, every single day, wondering, is this going to be the day that the whole world is going to get blown up in a massive bender of nuclear explosions? It was a great time to be alive, so let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now, before World War II was over, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all sat down together at something called the Yalta Conference. And it was here that they discussed their desires for the post-war world. They agreed that Germany should be divided into 4 zones occupied by the victors, and they further agreed that Poland should have free elections, and Romania and Bulgaria should have free elections as well. And they further agreed that an international peacekeeping organization ought to be formed, which they called the United Nations. And then they raised their glasses and sealed their talk with a shot of vodka. But after the war was over, it turns out that Russia and America don't much like each other without a common enemy to unite them together. America was capitalist and democratic, and Russia was communist. And that was only the beginning of their mutual suspicion. You see, America had committed the unpardonable sin of not telling Russia, our ally, that we had created a bomb that was capable of blowing holes in the earth. Russia, on the other hand, poo-pooed its agreements made at the Yalta Conference to allow democratic elections in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, and instead brought those countries into the USSR as spheres of influence. And on one level, you can't really blame Russia for wanting to do this, because they wanted a zone of protection between them and Germany, because this marks twice now that Russia had been stabbed in the gut by an aggressive German nation. But America saw this and was like, bruh, we heard y'all saying during the Bolshevik Revolution that y'all would not rest until the whole world was communist. And this action from Russia looked suspiciously like communist expansion. And since both communism and democracy have seeds within them that once planted want to take over all that exists, both ideologies wanted to remake the world in its own image. And so America and Russia found themselves in a tense eyeball-to-eyeball standoff known as the Cold War. And it was called cold because no actual fighting took place directly between the US and Russia, although there was some indirect fighting, which I'll mention in another lecture. Now, one of the promises that the big powers did keep after World War I is to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. Each of the zones was occupied by one of the great powers: the United States, Britain, France, and Russia. And it wasn't long before the US, Britain, and France began suggesting that a reunited Germany was the best thing for the restoration of Europe. But Stalin did not like that idea, and so he wanted to keep his portion of Eastern Germany to himself, and so it became apparent that Germany would remain divided. And it was especially tense in Berlin. The capital of Germany was also divided into 4 occupied zones, but the problem was that Berlin was nested right in the heart of Russian-occupied Eastern Germany. So in 1948, Stalin cut off all railway access to Berlin, and as a result, Berliners were starving and suffering. So the US fired up the very planes that had until recently been blowing up Berlin with bombs and organized something called the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, US planes dropped thousands of tons of supplies to the beleaguered Berliners. Eventually, Stalin backed off and formal governments were established both in Western and Eastern Germany. And thus, the Cold War congealed into a weird, furious bowl of fruit salad. Now remember, it was Harry Truman who climbed into the saddle of the American presidency when Franklin Roosevelt died. And it was Truman who led America to victory in World War II in the Pacific Theater. Now, over and over again, Russia had proved that it was relentlessly expansionistic. The old Russian bear would not hibernate until it had filled the entire world with its power and ideologies. And troubled at this, Truman issued what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine said that it was America's responsibility to resist communism by aiding other countries who are resisting communism, either by providing guns or planes or straight up hoo-hoo. And one of the most significant parts of the Truman Doctrine was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan proposed to pump billions of dollars into anemic Western European economies to help get them back on their feet. If these nations were strong economically, they reasoned, then they were unlikely to fall to Soviet bullying tactics. And it worked magnificently. The Marshall Plan drenched Europe in prosperity. And that only intensified the tension between Russia and America. But there is more tension to come. In September of 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb. And this shocked American experts who believed that it would be at least another 3 years before the Russians had such technological capacity. And so, taking a page right out of the playbook of Crocodile Dundee,
he's got a knife.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
Truman ordered the development of a much bigger bomb, namely the hydrogen bomb, which would be 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb, because at the end of the day, why have a bomb that's capable of killing 80,000 people when you can have a bomb that's capable of killing 80 million people, right? Now, Albert Einstein, whose work enabled the development of atomic bombs, and Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, tried ardently to dissuade Truman from pursuing the hydrogen bomb on account of it would be genocidal. After all, if a war of nuclear weaponry was instigated, there would be no world left for democracy and no world left for communism. But alas, we went ahead and figured out the hydrogen bomb, and the strongest bomb we ever tested was 1,039 times as powerful as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And now that we felt safe hiding behind a weapon that could potentially melt the faces off of half the world's population, we turned our attention towards home and tried to get our own house in order. It was all well and good to have communists in Russia, but to have communists in America? It became the common buzz that communist spies were everywhere in America, that they had infiltrated every part of American society, even the government. And this wasn't just hysteria. As I mentioned before, experts thought that Russia was still about 3 years away from developing the capability of making an atomic bomb. And when they started exploding atomic bombs way earlier than anybody had expected, there was only one explanation: spies. And now seems like a good time to introduce you to Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a Republican senator who ruthlessly led the charge to hunt down and purge every communist who had found his or her way into the ranks of the American government. He claimed to have a list of 205 members of the Communist Party who worked under the cover of the U.S. government. When he was pressed, McCarthy admitted it was only 57. And in the end, he couldn't even produce one credible allegation. But what made everyone believe McCarthy and not simply dismiss him as a fanatic crank was the intense suspicion and fear that the Cold War engendered. Now, eventually, McCarthy was discredited and dismissed from the Senate and died shortly thereafter of alcoholism. So it's pretty much like a happy ending for him. Now, the Cold War is soon going to turn hot when we get to the Korean and Vietnam Wars, but we're going to have to save those for other lectures. I will see you next time.